Growing up, my younger sister and I had a relationship like most siblings, playful, sometimes annoying, but always full of those little moments you laugh about later. She's 5 years younger than me, which made her an easy target for my pranks. I'll admit, I wasn't the nicest big brother. I'd jump out from behind doors to scare her or convince her that silly urban legends were true. She hated it, but I always figured she'd grow out of it eventually. One evening, not too long ago, I found myself alone at home. My parents had gone out to pick her up from school because she had stayed late for some after-school activity. It was a quiet, uneventful day, and I was just killing time scrolling on my phone in the living room. The house felt unusually still, the kind of stillness that makes you notice things you normally wouldn't. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the old wooden floors, the way shadows seemed to stretch longer as the sun set. I don't know why, but something about it felt off. I told myself it was nothing. I mean, I'd been alone in the house plenty of times before, but that night the silence wasn't peaceful. It felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on me. The clock on my phone read 5:45 p.m. My parents would probably be home soon with my sister. I thought about grabbing a snack before dinner and started heading toward the kitchen. That's when everything began. As I made my way to the kitchen, I passed the hallway that leads to our bedrooms. The corridor is narrow, with just enough space for a couple of people to walk side by side, and it's always been the darkest part of the house, even during the day. That evening, the shadows in the hallway seemed darker than usual, stretching out in jagged shapes across the floor. My bedroom door was slightly ajar, but my sister's room was shut tight, as it always was when she wasn't home. I barely glanced at them as I walked by. Then I saw her. Standing right there in the middle of the hallway was my sister. She was just standing there, perfectly still. Her head was tilted slightly to one side, and her hands were hanging limply by her sides. Her long brown hair, usually tied back in a ponytail, was loose, falling over her shoulders and partially obscuring her face. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing down the hallway. "You're home already? I thought Mom and Dad went to pick you up." She didn't answer. "Hello." I took a step closer. "Earth to little sister. You okay?" Still nothing. She didn't even flinch. She just stood there, staring at me. Or at least I thought she was staring. I couldn't see her eyes clearly because of the way her hair hung over her face. Something about her silence sent a chill up my spine. Normally, she would have rolled her eyes or told me to leave her alone by now. But this wasn't normal. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the creeping unease. "Okay, very funny. You're trying to freak me out, right? Well, it's not going to work." I walked past her, brushing her shoulder slightly as I did. Her skin felt ice cold, like she'd been standing outside in freezing weather. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to keep walking, determined to shrug it off as my imagination. When I reached the kitchen, I turned back to say something snarky, expecting her to be right behind me. But the hallway was empty. There was no sound of her footsteps retreating to her room. No sound at all. I stood there for a moment, staring into the dark hallway, my mind racing. My heart thudded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I'd just seen. And then, the faintest noise reached my ears, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling sound, like fabric brushing against the floor. It was coming from the direction of the stairs. The sound grew louder as I inched toward the hallway, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn around and forget about it. But I couldn't. Something compelled me to see where that noise was coming from, even though my gut told me I'd regret it. As I approached the top of the stairs, I saw her again. My sister, or at least what I thought was her, stood at the edge of the staircase, completely still. Her back was to me this time, Her shoulders hunched slightly, as if she were staring down into the shadows below. "Hey," I said, louder this time, my voice echoing in the eerie silence. "What are you doing?" She didn't respond. Slowly, she began to tilt her head backward, the movement impossibly slow and deliberate. My stomach twisted as her face came into view. It wasn't my sister. Her features were similar but wrong. Her skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, oh God, her eyes, were hollow, like black voids that seemed to suck in the dim light around them. Her mouth curved into a smile, one that stretched too wide, as if her lips were being pulled back by invisible strings. My legs locked in place, my breath caught in my throat. "You're not," I whispered, unable to finish the sentence. The figure tilted its head further, the grotesque grin growing impossibly larger. And then it moved. It didn't walk. It glided, almost like it was floating an inch above the ground. It came toward me, soundless but deliberate, those black voids where its eyes should have been locked onto mine. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I scrambled to get away. My heart hammered in my chest, and my mind raced with panic. I sprinted down the hallway, my only thought being to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. When I reached the kitchen, I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a heavy cast iron skillet, and turned to face the hallway, ready to defend myself. But the hallway was empty. I stood there, panting and trembling, my hands gripping the skillet so tightly my knuckles turned white. The house was silent again, save for the sound of my ragged breathing. Was I losing my mind? Had my imagination gotten the better of me? Then I heard it, a faint giggle, soft and childlike, echoing from the stairs. The giggle froze me in place. It wasn't playful or innocent. It was taunting, like a predator enjoying its hunt. Slowly, I backed toward the front door, keeping my eyes locked on the hallway where the sound had come from. I needed to leave, to get outside and wait for my parents. But as I reached for the doorknob, the lights in the house flickered and went out completely, plunging everything into darkness. My breath hitched. The only light came from the faint glow of the street lamps outside, barely seeping through the curtains. The house felt alive, the silence heavy, as though it were waiting for something. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, desperate for any source of light. My hands trembled as I unlocked the screen, illuminating the dim room around me. I held the phone up, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. Then I saw it. The figure, her, standing at the base of the stairs, staring up at me. Her grin was gone, replaced by an expression that sent a shiver down my spine. Pure malice. "Why are you here?" I forced the words out, my voice shaking. She tilted her head, as if considering my question. And then, in a voice that sounded like a distorted echo of my sister's, she replied, "You called me." My blood ran cold. Called her. I had no idea what she meant, but her words carried a weight that felt undeniable. As she began to move up the stairs, I bolted. My instincts took over, and I ran toward the back of the house, hoping to find an exit. But every door I tried was locked, the windows sealed shut. Her voice followed me, echoing from all directions. "You shouldn't have turned off the lights. You shouldn't have looked." I found myself in the laundry room, cornered with nowhere else to go. The air grew colder, and the smell of damp earth filled the space. My phone's light flickered, its battery draining rapidly. Panic set in as the shadows around me began to shift, coalescing into her shape. She emerged from the darkness, standing only a few feet away now, her eyes boring into mine. "You can't leave," she whispered, her tone almost pitying. "Not until you see." The room spun, the walls seeming to close in around me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stare as she reached out, her fingers impossibly long, her touch ice cold against my skin. I woke up on the cold tile floor of the laundry room, gasping for air like I'd been underwater. My phone was beside me, dead. The house was silent, eerily so, as if nothing had happened. I scrambled to my feet, my head pounding and my heart racing. The memory of her face, those eyes, that voice, was seared into my mind. My hands trembled as I reached for the doorknob to the hallway. But this time, it turned with ease. The house was exactly as it had been before the lights went out. No signs of struggle, no evidence of the figure I'd seen. It was almost as if it had all been a nightmare. But then I looked toward the stairs. There at the base lay something that hadn't been there before, a small, cracked porcelain doll. Its face was eerily familiar, with eyes that seemed to follow me no matter where I stood. I picked it up cautiously, a chill running down my spine as I noticed the faint, almost imperceptible giggle echoing in my mind. Before I could process what it meant, the sound of the garage door opening broke the silence. My parents were home. Relief washed over me as I bolted to the front door, flinging it open to greet them. But when they stepped inside, my sister wasn't with them. "Where's Emma?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My mom frowned, confused. "She's at a sleepover tonight. We told you before we left." The words hit me like a freight train. My knees buckled, and the porcelain doll slipped from my grasp, shattering against the floor. The events of the night came flooding back, each detail more horrifying than the last. The girl in the hallway, the voice, the way she looked like Emma but wasn't. I turned to my parents, desperation in my eyes. There was someone here. She looked like Emma, but it wasn't her. My dad cut me off, putting a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You've had a long day. Let's get you some rest." But I knew it wasn't a dream. As I lay in bed that night, every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind sent my heart racing. The image of her face was burned into my mind, her final words echoing endlessly. "You called me." From that night on, I never stayed home alone again. Even now, years later, I can't walk through a dark hallway without feeling her presence, waiting just beyond the edge of the light. And every so often, in the dead of night, I hear the faint sound of giggling, accompanied by the icy whisper, "You called me."